All right, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to our next Access 21 session, You and Your Association Strategic Plan. I am Jacob Adams, and I am the Director of Conferences, Exhibits, and Sponsorships for the Association for Materials Protection and Performance. And I am so happy to be here with you all today to discuss this very important topic. Before we begin, we just want to go ahead and go through a couple housekeeping reminders throughout the session today, as well as through the session tomorrow throughout the event. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the Need Help tab on the platform. And just so you know, all attendees' microphones will be muted to ensure that we have a smooth audio experience. So please use the chat function in Zoom or in the platform to make sure that we can receive your questions that you might have as we go through the dialogue, and also so you can connect with fellow attendees as a form of networking. Also, this session is being recorded, so you will be able to access the session after it takes place. So if you want to come back and listen to it again, we definitely encourage you to do so. We also want you to go ahead and provide feedback and complete the survey when you receive it, because your feedback is valuable and it helps us on the program committee ensure that future sessions at Access 22 and webinars that CES runs is meeting the needs of our members. So please make sure you go ahead and complete that. We also want to take a moment just to thank Quebec City Business Destinations as a partner and supporter of this event. It is partnerships with organizations like Quebec City Business Destinations that make events like Access 21 possible. So we do thank you for your support. So again, as I mentioned, I am Jacob Adams, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's session. I will be joined by three of my esteemed colleagues from other STEM societies to discuss the strategic planning process, and hopefully we'll have some great takeaways for you to implement with your organization. So without further ado, I will go ahead and let our speakers introduce themselves. I'm joined by Nicole, Susanna, and Larry today. So Nicole, if you want to go ahead and get things kicked off and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Jacob. I'm Nicole Boston. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Society of Fire Protection Engineers. I'm this year's chair of CES, and we just went through a great strategic planning exercise in 2020. So I'm excited to share that with everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you. Susanna?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm Susanna Kelly, and I'm a principal at McKinley Advisors. At McKinley, we help a number of different associations with their strategic plans. I'm sure some of you on the session today have worked with us, or maybe are working with us right now. So we'll be sharing some perspectives about sort of what we see across the industry and some best practices that might be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Larry?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking a little bit of your time to join us this afternoon or this morning. Larry Sloan, CEO of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. We are a professional society of occupational and environmental health and safety professionals. And I'm particularly excited to participate in this panel because we are in the process right now of implementing our next evolution of our strategic plan. So I'll be commenting on that over the next several minutes. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so as we get things kicked off here, you know, I think it'll be really good for us to go ahead and implement a poll, because I think it would be really great for us to get a sense of who's joining us today. And I know we have a lot to cover in a short time, but I think it would be beneficial to see where folks are in the strategic planning process and who all's involved in their organization. So if Louise, if we could go ahead and put up the first poll. Everyone could go ahead and take a moment to complete that. We're interested to know how many staff are directly involved in the strategic planning process for your organization. I love the live polls. It's so fun to see as everyone's chiming in. So we'll leave that up for just a few more seconds. All right, so we've got a good mix of folks, so that's always good because we can hear some different perspectives and hopefully get some great discussion going in the chat. So just a few more seconds, maybe 5 more seconds, Louise, and we'll go ahead and close that. All right. Okay, we've got a good mix. So, all right. So, Louise, if you don't mind putting up the next one, the next poll we'd be interested. Oh, I'm sorry. I can only see the results. My apologies. Let me go ahead and publish that. So the results should be showing now, so you guys can see that it's a pretty good mix. Seems like we have just a handful of folks, 1 to 3 at some organizations, and then there's a good chunk of folks that 27% of those joining us today with 11 or more. So that's great. That's great. All right. And then real quick, Louise, if we can go ahead and put up the second poll. Perfect. Okay, so which statement best describes your organization's current status of the strategic planning process? We're all in different places in this journey, so we wanted to know where everyone is from today's call. All right, just a few more seconds. Last minute selections, and we'll go ahead and close this. All right. So again, we have a pretty decent selection of people that are maybe have not yet begun the process and are looking to do so in the next couple of months, or maybe you're in the beginning stages. Those that are in the middle of the process, and we've even got a few that have recently completed it. So congratulations to you. And we look forward to hearing some wisdom. Please feel free to share in the chat box. But all right. So as we get things kicked off, given that we have a variety of attendees for the session that are at various levels within their organization and different stages of the planning process, I think a good place to start our dialogue would be for us to hear from each of you on the panel about why is it important for staff to care about the strategic planning process, whether you're the CEO, a manager, a director, a coordinator. Why is it important? So Nicole, I don't know if you wanted to maybe get things kicked off for us.
I'd love to, just as soon as I unmute myself. Thank you, Jacob. Yes, I think, I've been in the association world almost 25 years now, and have worked in a number of different organizations that have handled it differently. I think what I'm about to share in this presentation, our experience the last 18 months was by far the best experience we've had. And I say that because I think if it's executed correctly, it integrates with your operations so well. It can help inform management, budgeting, evaluations, set those goals, and it can really effectively be the tool that drives the organizational success from top to bottom. If it's not done, and I've experienced that as well, as I'm sure everyone has, it can be just that big tome that sits on the bookshelf, and not much happens. And it's a major investment that staff chirp about and say, why did we spend all that money? Why are they going to retreats? What is this for? So I think hitting that right balance is something I'm excited to share, that I feel we did this past year. But yes, I think why it's important is because it really is providing the guidance directly from your board of directors, whose responsibility it is to set the strategic direction. So it really helps define the roles between the board of directors and the staff, and then having real clarity on what is expected for whatever that term of that plan is, whether it's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, or longer. So I think it's really critical if done right.
Great. Larry, how about you? Do you have thoughts on why it's important?
I do, and I'm going to build upon what Nicole just said. And, my big issue with a strategic plan is, again, it's not something that sits on a shelf. It must be relatable to everybody in the enterprise. And so, like Nicole said, it's your roadmap for the next so many years, right? So we just had our board of directors just approved our next strategic plan, which will take effect January 1st of 2022. And we're now in the process of rolling out both an internal communications plan to staff and an external communications plan to all of our committees and advisory groups across the membership. On staff, it's critical that the entire leadership team buys into the concept that everybody plays a role in making this plan work. Everybody has a responsibility, even if you're in an overhead capacity like finance or HR or IT, you support the staff who then supports the external facing elements of the plan. So everybody is dialed into the plan through their department or through their particular working group. And I would hope that your organization's leadership is taking the time to communicate how each and every staff member maps against the plan, which strategies in the plan are specifically relevant to each department within the plan. And then those department heads can then relay that to the members of that department. How does everybody get tied into the plan? And then ultimately that will inform everybody's personal goals for the following year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Susanna, what about you? Do you have any additional thoughts on the importance of everyone's involvement?
Yeah, Jacob, and I'm just going to echo to what Larry and Nicole have just said, because it is so important for leaders and associations to communicate about the plan. And it's not just like a, oh, yay, it's done. Here it is. And then we never talk about it again, right? You have to communicate and communicate and communicate. It's almost to the point of being like, if you feel like you're communicating about it too much, you're probably right on track. Because that kind of repetition in your communications, be it with your members, or in this case, right, we're talking about staff, is I think what's going to help people to see how it pulls through all of their work activities. So you want the staff to be able to see themselves in the plan and see their work in the outcomes that are outlined in the plan. So if the staff don't know how they fit into the plan, they're not going to be engaged. And worse, they won't even try to align their programs with the goals of the plan, right? So we all know that in associations, you've got a lot going on. And if you've got programs that are sort of like drifting off here and not aligning with your focus, that's just pulling resources away from the direction that you really want to head. So helping staff to see, oh, how can I begin to tweak this program so that I can better align with where we're headed, right? And for me, those stories of, for example, like someone in the overhead category, like somebody from IT, when they come up to you and they're like, I am so excited about this strategic priority, and I know that my work can help this organization meet its goals. That's the sort of fire and passion that I think we all want, right? So we have to help people to see that and see how they fit in and they connect with the plan and its outcomes.
Absolutely. It makes it so much more rewarding. Kind of a theme that just emerged from the three of you is, depending on the size of the organization and workload and resources, especially over the last year and a half, I think we can all agree that our resources have been tested and challenged. I'm just curious, and maybe Nicole or Larry, you can start off with this one, but how do you feel organizations should prioritize those limited resources to make sure that they're being used effectively? I don't know, Larry, if you want to get things kicked off.
Sure. So the first thing that I would suggest is, typically organizations will form a strategic planning task force. And you typically want to have a very diverse representation on the task force. We make sure that we have a diversity of career experience, people of color, of ethnicity, of thought, and various other parameters. And so you want to make sure that you've got a diverse set of perspectives so that as you're sitting down and defining what is success going to look like at the end of this work product, right? When you develop your next plan, what is success going to look like? How are you going to know that you're actually meeting the mission and ultimately the vision of the organization? And so, that's the first step. And then you want to populate that task force with some key staff members. And you know what? Maybe you don't want to have always the senior leadership team folks represented on that task force. You might want to have some mid-level folks to give them that experience and exposure to get involved and participate in those conversations. That really builds loyalty from those folks that aren't necessarily at the top echelon of the organization. In terms of prioritizing resources, a lot of times the strategic planning process starts with an environmental scan, a survey of the membership, and that's what we did over the last several months, where we, again, looked at a cross-representation of our members. We wanted to make sure that we had our more advanced veteran members, our early career professionals, our students, our international members, various technical committee representation. And so we're about an 8,000 member organization. We sent out the survey to about 1,000 folks and got a very, very healthy response rate. And the survey helped us to identify what's the impact of things like federal regulations on the profession and the association. What is the impact of technology on the profession and the association? Global trends and demographics in general. And I think as we delved into the output of that survey, we were then able to provide some guideposts that helped us define our conversations as to what success should look like and what we should be building into the plan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nicole, how about you? I know you're also, as you mentioned at the beginning in your introduction, you're embarking on this process or have been involved in this process. So thoughts from you? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, my mouse froze. Sorry. What can go wrong when you're live? Apologies. Yeah, everything that Larry just said, although I would say one of the things that came up with us last year was we found we did have a strategic planning task group. And what we, I think, surprisingly, happily discovered is really all the board wanted to be invested and be a part of it. So we did disband the committee and we had the full board take ownership for it. We also had a unique set of circumstances in doing it during the pandemic. So we were doing all of our meetings and collaborations virtually. So it lent itself to it. But I even think going forward, we'll do that. I mean, we have been spending and investing a lot in board orientation and development and really imparting on them. I should mention I'm from an engineering organization, so a board of engineers who do like to delve into details and keeping them and reminding them of the strategic priorities that we're really looking to them to do. I think adding to what Larry said too, another important thing that we worked with our facilitator on was establishing upfront what our current critical operational activities were and keeping that at the forefront. So with boards, often you have, what you want, great excitement and ideas and the like, but my gosh, that can turn into quite a menu and listing of different activities that people want to take on. And so we found it really helpful as kind of a foundational base to highlight, the magazine, the annual conference, all of these pretty intensive resource activities that we were going to continue to do. And I should also mention our staff right now is fluctuating between 10 and 15. So we're a smaller organization, which is critical too. So I look at the prioritization as fitting in with the critical items that we're already embarking on, that we don't get whiplash and try to change courses, because as I said in my opening remarks, we really try to do a good job of integrating this from the plan into our budgets, into our committee structures and our annual operating plans, both for the volunteer committees as well as for the staff plans and goals for staff and evaluations. And so when it's driven through that entire thing, you don't want a new president in town or a new board member coming in and suddenly saying we've got to do something else that we don't have the resources for, and or that would put at risk initiatives that we've already started or are midway through. So I think bringing all of that and putting that at the front of those conversations before everyone starts thinking about all of the new activities they would like to do has helped us prioritize and really be realistic about what we can accomplish to ensure success.
That's great. That's great. Susanna, I know you've worked with a variety of organizations of varying sizes. What are some of your thoughts on the prioritization and maybe what you've seen for smaller scale associations to larger scales that might have over 100 employees? I mean, are you seeing similarities or are you seeing differences, and any thoughts you might share about prioritizing those resources?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most important parts of strategic planning. And Nicole, you just sort of hit on it as you think about the layering on that can happen within associations. Strategic planning oftentimes creates new initiatives, and we have to make sure we have resources to deliver on those. So it's rare, at least in my experience, that you find an association that's got like, a lot of staff who just don't have anything on their plate, right? Like everybody has a lot going on already. So how do we really begin to address these not as additional responsibilities as assigned, but truly as part of your workaday world? And so I think there's a couple of things that we have seen and that we recommend sort of as a best practice. And one of those things is to do a regular portfolio review and really look across the organization for opportunities to either sunset programs that are no longer delivering value or reposition those programs, like I was talking about before, where you can sort of redirect them or realign them with the strategic plan. This is not easy work. This is really difficult, especially for associations that have legacy programs that are attached to a particular member group, right? And it gets political. So the strategic planning time, I think, is the perfect time to start to do that kind of activity and to get into a habit of doing it more regularly, so that it's not something that's one and done, but you're sort of more regularly reviewing programs, and people get used to that rhythm, so that the next time their program comes up for review, it's not so scary. It's more part of the sort of operational discipline of the organization. Again, it gives us an excuse to communicate about the plan and about the plan's priorities and think about how we align to that. So sunsetting those programs or redirecting those resources, because sometimes it's not really a sunset, it's more like a shifting of resources, if you will. It allows us to realign where we're putting our effort, where we're putting our money, where we're putting our time, putting our talent, all of that stuff into these new opportunities. And the last thing that I'll say is that we know it doesn't happen overnight, right? It's not like a switch that we flip and automatically all this stuff is right where we need it to be. Probably you're going to need a transition plan. You're going to need a few years to sort of ramp up into these new strategic initiatives, maybe move away from some things that have been happening so that those resources can be redirected in future years. And all of that takes time and planning to get into place. But my experience is that when that's done, not only is the impact from the strategic plan really felt and meaningful, but again, staff are really feeling engaged because they can see that the hard work that they're doing is really paying off.
That's great. I think, Susanna, you might have just suggested another session for Access 22. I think about the politics behind it and the discussion of sunsetting programs and how to position organizations effectively to help implement that change. I think that that's something that probably resonates with a lot of the folks on the call today. Definitely a key component to ensure the long-term success of implementing the plan. There was another area that I kind of wanted to pull on a little bit that you had mentioned it just now was, so once the organization has set their priorities or have identified the resources that they have as they embark on the journey, I think the next key piece that you had touched on was performance or measuring progress, because if you're not measuring it, how do you know you're successful? And I think it would be really valuable to hear from the group, what are those steps that we can do as staff to help support each other, but also to help our member leaders and help them champion our programs and initiatives that we're looking to embrace moving forward. So I don't know if you have thoughts on how your organization has embraced performance and progress in measuring and metrics and things like that.
Yeah, so just a quick comment just to follow up on what was just said,
Sure.
and Susanna just kind of piqued my mind here for a minute. one of the things that I want to make sure everybody takes away, and this is not an easy conversation to have with boards, but resource limitations and staff bandwidth, right? So if the board has these aspirations that in this new plan, you're going to do A, B, C, D, E, but there isn't appropriate staffing to develop those programs, you got to have, and it's usually the role of the executive director or the CEO to sit down with the board. And this is exactly what I've been doing to say, we'll meet you as to the best of our ability, but we don't have the staffing in place to do anything more than we're doing right now. So if you want us to do above and beyond, and there are the financial resources to allocate towards additional staffing or additional outsourcing, let's have that conversation. Because boards will sit around all day long and talk about all the great things that fall under the new strategic plan. But at the end of the day, if the staff's already tapped out, how's the work going to get done? So that's something that I've been beating this proverbial drum. I mean, every single board meeting, it's like, okay, no, wait a minute. To Susanna's point, does something need to drop off if we're going to do something else that's new? Okay. So let me go back to your question about metrics. And I do want to say that we have been very diligent in developing quantitative board KPIs, which are key performance indicators. And we have our strategic plan, like many others, basically separated into domains. Okay, so we have a domain that's for awareness of the profession and awareness of the association. We have one on community, we have one on education, and one on advocacy, and so forth. So for each one of these domains, we have a series of KPIs that the board has approved, and we then report out to the board at each board meeting throughout the year, measuring our progress against year-end goals. And now we're tracking over the last 4 years, we're now tracking the historical trend in each of those KPIs. Some of the KPIs will fall off over the course of time, and other KPIs we will add and replace others. But we now have a dashboard that we share with the board so they can see what kind of progress we've made against those, KPIs that started 4 years ago to the present, those that have been accomplished, they're once and done. What are the new ones that we've added to the plate? So it's a combination of those quantitative KPIs, and you pick a few dashboard indicators per each of your domains or areas of initiatives. And then there's that qualitative assessment. And we do a qualitative assessment against the plan, the middle of every year, and then at the end of every year. Just giving the board a sense as to the high level activities and projects that have actually helped to address the different strategies of the plan. So there's two parts to it: quantitative KPIs, qualitative assessment in terms of types of projects and initiative that are making progress against the strategies.
That's great. That's great. Nicole, I know your organization, you've mentioned in some of our conversations that you've grown quite a bit in the last couple of years. So I'd imagine tracking and measuring progress within your organization is imperative for staff resources and moving initiatives forward. So anything that you wanted to share about measurement and progress?
Yes, and like Larry, I'd like to back up
Sure.
to that last
Sorry.
conversation and add one more item too.
Sure.
It just actually came up this morning in a finance committee call that I had, but I think it applies to all organizations having come out of the pandemic and looking at our reserves. So most of our organizations have some pretty hefty reserves, and there are metrics that ASAE and other organizations put out on what the recommended amount of reserves are for organizations. Pre-pandemic, I think it was anywhere between 3 months and a year of operating costs, and different groups would recommend different amounts. One of the conversations, so as far as prioritizing, has been asking the board when they have these bigger ideas to feel a little bit of that pain as well and give up some of that reserve money to fund those with staff. And so it's been a conversation around talking about, this is a professional service. We're not buying materials and goods like a lot of our board members and the companies they work for do. So their budgets look different than ours. I have found kind of increasingly that our board is uncomfortable at times, more uncomfortable with the staffing increases than maybe the technology or other investments. They're and I understand that it's more of a temporary investment, but looking now at what I would say was probably for all of us the most unforeseeable 18 months that we've been through. And if you're still intact or you've thrived through it and are going strong, maybe it's a time to look back and say, maybe we could be taking more. Maybe we were too conservative in how much of our investments we've been using and utilizing. And right now I'm pitching to our board that this is a really pivotal moment for a lot of organizations and for the competition in the business period. And that any more that we can give, we'll just be able to accelerate on our mission and have a greater impact. So to prioritizing, I find one of the member dues, it's hard to really make a significant change. You can increase, you can sure expand, but it's incremental. And for a lot of organizations that are fortunate enough to have that, it's an option. Going back to performance and how we evaluate it, we do a lot of what Larry was saying, in probably not as a sophisticated way. We really take of course. What were the
real time
delivery? Sorry, guys. We take a spreadsheet and we plot the entire strategic plan against the spreadsheet, and then we budget it across. So all of existing items, all of the new items, all of that filters down into the department budgets and ultimately gets that approval. Like for the KPIs, that feeds right into the staff evaluations and the staff performance. And I, like Larry, I guess, I'm sure most organizations, I do quarterly reports, then tracking the outcomes and our progress to the plan back to the board. And so I really stay focused on the strategic plan as far as what we've accomplished and not all of the day-to-day. It's really reduced the amount of what I'm reporting back and the amount of reporting we're doing. And I think that's been a really great way to keep the plan and our focus on what we're trying to achieve in front of everybody. I will also add that maybe a little untraditionally, we have really implored the staff from day one, and it's definitely more of a ground up than top down approach in the planning. So, and fortunately our board's been pretty receptive to it. So we really start with the staff and saying, what would your needs be? What do you think the KPIs would be? You know, if you had the resources, what could you accomplish? What would you need to accomplish that? And they basically draft the plan in essence that then goes to the board with their committee's blessings. So everyone's on the same page, and really it's turned into more the board making modifications or adding on to that conversation, as opposed to just coming up with something completely brand new and ta-da to the staff after the process is over, which really never works for anyone. So it's probably not traditionally how things have been done, but the last few cycles of our strategic planning, we've done that more and more, and including committees, chairs, and all staff right from the get-go and doing it bottom up.
That's great. I like the bottom up approach. I realize that can be implemented with some organizations with greater success than others, but I think that's also goes back to the first topic we talked about of getting that buy-in and understanding the importance of the strategic plan across the organization. I think that helps really drive that point home. Susanna, did you have any other thoughts about measuring performance and what you've seen with some of the organizations you've worked with?
I think Larry and Nicole really hit on the high points. Definitely having that dashboard, a high level dashboard that you're sharing with your board regularly to update them on progress. Probably a little bit more of an operational dashboard that's being used by the senior team and the staff to monitor programs at a more granular level, right? But the thing that I think bears mentioning is that the reality for many associations is that you don't have the data that you hope you would to build out your perfect dashboard. And there's going to be metrics, particularly as it relates to your outcomes and key performance indicators that are anticipating or helping you to anticipate new moves, that you're going to have a gap and you don't have the data at all, or the data that you have is not clean. And so I just want to reassure everybody that that's common, and that sometimes the effort that you want to make is actually just to create a baseline. Like maybe this strategic planning cycle, your goal is to better understand your baseline so that you know then what you can look to measure in your next and your next and your next summit. garbage in, garbage out. We know that phrase. If your data is not good, do not try to force it into your dashboard because it will not be a positive thing for you, and you'll end up not using the information in the end to make decisions. So just know that this is something you can work toward, and try to be as tight as you can with putting together that dashboard so that you're really focused on the things that matter rather than having like 100,000 metrics you're trying to monitor all at the same time.
That is absolutely, data is key, and making sure that it's helping you tell your story and the direction you want to go. I know we're going to save some time for questions at the end, but there was actually a comment that came in through the chat box that, since we're talking about it, it might be good to pull on this a little bit more. It was actually for Nicole. Chris had shared that he's intrigued by the bottom up of the approach that you take to developing the strategic plan, and he's curious to know how your board reacted to that, because there might be some concern, at least with his board, that they might feel a little bit slighted if they're trying it out this way, and thought it might, which, you know, even though he thinks it might lead to a more productive end result. So maybe a little bit more about how your board reacted to that, and if there was any opposition, how did you navigate that conversation with them?
Sure. Great question. And I will say that I think, maybe just my bias, but I think as a CEO too, and I talking to other CEOs as well, you know, in the private sector, for instance, typically strategy is the role of the CEO. In associations like ours, it's the role of the board of directors. And most of our board of directors are made up of our members. I know there's a few that have been a little more inventive in getting more of skills and competency-based boards, but our members are not necessarily doing strategy in their organizations, are not necessarily doing generative thinking and the like. And I think there's probably many sessions that could be done about some of the changes that we're seeing as far as who's coming on boards and the transitioning. And so, to be fair, I think our board was more receptive to this because of the trust that's been built between the staff and the board, understanding, and we've had many years of very good wins and successes, so that trust is there. And I think a recognition by the board members that ultimately it is the staff and the committees and the volunteer, their fellow members, that are going to be executing. And so why not? So that said, I will say having a competent and skilled facilitator to facilitate that dialogue was also very helpful. And I would say there were times where, you know, there were conversations with myself and the facilitator and our president. There were times where we had an executive committee and us. So there was a lot of priming and getting that buy-in before we were necessarily going into the meeting itself, so that there was clarity and there was support around those ideas. So for that very reason, so that it didn't seem that the staff were setting, you know, things too low, or, you know, this was just an activity that the staff could have done on their own, and there was too much influence by the staff. So it did work really well. It was very effective. So far, so good. We're in year 2, but that is how we managed it, and I think that's how we'll manage it going forward. And I didn't get a chance to say that earlier, and I should have. We also went from a book to a one-pager. So our strategic plan is 1 page. It's a visual document. It works great in PowerPoint. It's something that we can easily share with members. And that also makes it much easier to document and tie into our budgets and our annual operating plans and evaluations. So keeping it shorter, simpler. Again, size matters. We're a smaller organization, but I think that also makes these conversations a little easier too, because we're not biting off 50 things, right? We're really focused on 1 or 4 goals. We have 4 goals and like 2 key objectives for a 3-year plan, is what our board, and that was kind of what we set out for at the start, was what is really realistic for a 3-year plan. This isn't a 5-year, this isn't 10 years. You know, there's budget cycles that need to get through, and then there's all this existing work. So making sure those expectations were clear up front, and then yeah, a part of it is just, I think, luck and timing that's worked really well for us.
Sure, sure. And Larry, I think you also your organization, I don't know if it's a one pager, but you were also, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, we're talking about that it's a rather condensed version, so it's easily digestible, correct?
Yes, and Nicole just toggled my memory because we do have a one pager that we use for external audiences. As a matter of fact, this new plan that I'm mentioning will have a graphic that's going to be published in our monthly news magazine, excuse me, that's coming out at the end of the year. But Nicole made me think about larger organizations where you might have other sub entities under what I call the mothership. So AIJ is a little more of a complex organization because we have 3 limited liability corporations and we have 2 foundations. Each one, and we have actually another allied association. So each one of those entities has its own strategic plan. But what we wanted to do with the mothership plan, which is the one that the board just approved, was to link the mothership plan to those sub plans. So we're not baking everything into the mothership plan because the plan would be, 5,000 pages long, right? So we want to reference those sub plans in the master plan and then get into the details of those plans in those entities' respective strategic plans. And so the sub plans have their own KPIs. Some of those KPIs roll up into the master mothership strategic plan, and the rest of the details don't. So there really is a lot of congruence between them, but you don't want to restate everything in the sub plans that figures into the major plan. But yes, we do have a condensed kind of a one pager, if you will. It's more of a visual that lists the again, the domains, the mission, the vision. We have a value proposition statement, our 5 domains, some key strategic objectives under each of those 5 domains, and then some of the key metrics that we're trying to track over this 3-year period. For internal purposes and with the board, that's where we get into much more of the details and we get into the strategies and the operations that then support those strategies.
Absolutely. And for those folks who, I know there's some activity going on in the chat, which is great. I know people were interested in seeing what the one pager is, and Chris is on top of it. He shared a link he found on Nicole's website of their one pager. So that's great if anybody was looking for that. There was a question, if Larry, if your one pager, is that publicly available yet, or will that be on your website when that infographic and that information is available?
A few more months, we'll have it out.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. And then there was one other question. I know there's one more topic we want to get to. We've talked about this could be a half-day workshop or dialogue, and I know we've only got this little bit of time, but there was a good question that came through about new board members. And do any of you have a suggestion or a template, or do you compile a report that shows yearly progress? I know we talked about the KPIs, but to share with new board members so you're not consistently rehashing or revisiting topics and decisions that were made in the past. So is that maybe part of an onboarding packet for new board members, or what might that look like in your organizations?
We at AIHA, we have a pretty extensive board orientation process. And during our first part of our orientation, we do go over the strategic plan. And that document where I indicated we provide a qualitative assessment of activities against the various strategies, we provide that document. The latest iteration of that document gets shared with all the new board members so they can see here's the plan and here's the latest status report against that plan. And here on the side are the KPIs, the quantitative KPIs that map against the plan. So we do share all of that detail so they get up to speed rather quickly.
Great, great. All
We-
right. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say,
Yeah.
we're not quite that sophisticated yet, but we do really, we do our presentations, our annual reports and everything are structured and framed around the 4 goals of our plan. So we try to keep that in the forefront of not only the board and the metrics going back to the board with historical data, but also anything that we do out to the membership. Our chapters, we have 110 plus chapters. So really trying to keep that continuity and messaging the same throughout the organization.
Great, great. All right. Well, I think, one of the other topics, and I encourage folks to continue to submit questions and having dialogue in the chat. This has been great to see the conversation going on. One of the other topics that we wanted to make sure that we addressed or to get to before the session wraps up today. Yeah, I know we've touched on COVID and the effects of the pandemic, and as we're starting to come out of it, but there's obviously still some hesitancy and concerns about in-person programming and things like that. I'm curious to hear from you, especially since Nicole, it sounds like yours just wrapped up right before the pandemic, although you've been actively having meetings during the pandemic. And I know, Larry, as you mentioned, you're just, getting to those final stages of crossing the finish line. I'm interested to know if you have any insights or suggestions or lessons learned for those folks, because if you recall during our second polling question, we had a good mix of people who haven't started, or maybe they're in the beginning stages or the middle stages. I'd imagine that there might be some folks that are conflicted or a bit stalled, or we just created this wonderful plan and then COVID hit and we got thrown this curveball. And is our plan, all this time and effort and resources we spent, is this plan now obsolete? And what do we do with the plan? Do we have to redo the process all over again? So any insights that you all would like to share? I don't know, Larry, since you're just finishing up your plan and getting ready to publish it, any thoughts now that you've been through this and real-time experience and how it might have shifted the dialogue among your member leaders and staff?
So very quickly, when our strategic planning task force formed for this iteration of the plan, it formed last fall. And the first exercise that I decided to run the task force through was, let's look at the current plan, the one that ends at the end of this year, and let's make some adjustments for the current plan in response to the pandemic. So that was actually the first responsibility. Before we even retained the consultant, the facilitator, to guide our conversations, I had the task force review the current plan and we tweaked some of the strategies. We then brought that revised current plan to the board in February of this year, and they approved those changes. So it was kind of an interim tweak. And then obviously with the development of our next plan, the pandemic and the virtual education was embedded throughout all of our domains. All that to say, I think my takeaway message in all this is that the plan, like others have said, is a living document, right? The plan is not static. And I think it's imperative upon all of us to look at the plan as something that can be adjusted each and every year as circumstances warrant.
Absolutely. Nicole?
Yeah, so we actually did ours during the pandemic. So we started our exercise in March, April of last year. And I will say that I think if the board sticks to sticking at a strategic level and making it a strategic document, and I put this in the chat as well, talking about outcomes and objectives, it really should be applicable, right? Regardless of the state of your current state. I think planning forward, we're going to see more disruption. It seems to be that's going to be the norm. And so I would not personally recommend people wait. I don't know that there's going to be a better time. But I think if you do stick to your strategic plan and keep it at a strategic level, that allows the staff and the people who have been charged with the operations and the execution of it to change the way they execute. So we still want to deliver on one of our goals to be to create a more inclusive environment. So for instance, that was one of our 4 major goals that we came out with last year. How we might do that and what areas we might focus on may change based on what we're able to do as a result of the pandemic or whatever else may come next. But I think having that clarity that the separation between what the strategy is and how the execution of it can change and should change. It should be flexible and should be able to be adopted as needed, especially when you have a multi-year plan. You really just can't anticipate what happens next. It's also why we did a 3-year plan. So I know back in the day, you used to see 10-year plans and those 5-year plans, 7-year plans. That's a really long time, and the pace of business, things change, technologies are obsolete. So many things happen so quickly as we all see in our daily lives. So our board chose 3 years. We felt that, provided continuity and would be able to make a significant impact on some of the goals and initiatives that we were looking at, but would not be so long that it could not, that we'd be stuck in something that had outlived itself. So I think understanding your timeline and what can be done in that timeline and understanding that change happens and it's happening faster is important as well.
Absolutely. Susanna, what about you? I know, you've obviously been working with a lot of different clients over the last couple of years. So anything that you've seen that you'd want to share?
Yeah, we do have this really opportunity. it's pretty cool to see across the whole industry, right? And see sort of what's happening in this past year has been no exception. We certainly saw associations who really leaned into their strategic plans, right? And accepted this as a moment, as an opportunity to make really, really targeted investments. We also saw that there were others that were not in a position to do that, either financially due to their reserves or just because of the level of change that was happening and disruption that was happening within their industry. And in those cases, right, it was more of like a reprioritization, kind of like what Larry and Nicole are talking about, right? Where your plan is flexible and your team is working on their nimbleness to ensure that you're taking in new information, adjusting and continuing forward, right? And that process becomes almost constant. That's a really healthy skill to build in any case. So that's really good. I also saw a handful of associations, I would say it was really in the minority, but a handful that completely scrapped their plan and moved to a much shorter planning horizon. And I think it most often had to do with just the level of uncertainty and lack of confidence in what would happen next. And so to Nicole's point about like the 3-year plan, I don't get asked so much anymore about like, well, should this be a 3-year or 5-year plan? Because people are not ready to think about 5 years, not to mention longer than that. And so there are some associations that are actually looking at like 1 year or 18-month horizons, depending again on sort of, what is their mix of programs, what's happening in their industry, and, do they even have the headspace to be able to go farther than that? And I just want to say too, that there's not a right answer here. I think that it really depends on what your organization needs in this moment. So I would agree, don't wait, don't be paralyzed by this, but at the same time, know that if you hear of one association that's going for 3 years and you feel like you got to go 18 months, that's totally okay.
That's great.
Can I add one more thing onto that too?
Sure.
Logistically, because we did it last year during the pandemic, we were forced to do it in a remote setting and through Zoom. Pluses and minuses on that. But I do think keeping some aspect of that, we had some lessons learned through that, which it did allow for more iterative processing. So we were able to take a topic and, as opposed to if you're doing a day retreat or a 2-day retreat, you're really getting your best thinking for that moment in time. This way, we were much more able to go back and get data, get information, get historical facts or numbers, get input from committees or folks that needed it to be able to bring to the next conversation. So I do think there was something to be said about splitting up that process and not doing it all in one chunk, as often is done, and how we had been doing it in the past actually turned out to be quite helpful.
I totally agree. We did everything virtual this past spring, and it gave us time to, again, go back, collect the data, have smaller group discussions before coming back together as a larger task force. And I think the product that we produced was probably more thought-provoking and more comprehensive and sensitive to the current drivers that are affecting our profession than the last iteration. I think every plan that we do is an evolution on the one before. And so I would agree that the virtual opportunity affords more introspection and reflection over the process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like, Nicole, you mentioned it's not always a one size fits all. You got to take bits and pieces and tailor the approach to what makes sense for your organization and your board members. So that's a really good key takeaway. So I know we're coming up on the end of the session, a little minutes left. I know we've sprinkled some of the questions throughout the presentation. Am I frozen? Can you guys see me? No? Am I frozen?
You are, but we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
All right. Well, we're just going to wing it. We're going to go with it. So, if there's any other questions that you want to submit in the chat box, or I know Susanna had suggested maybe sharing some stories or examples of what maybe has worked or what hasn't worked for organizations, for those folks that are on the call. If there's any words of wisdom that you wanted to share with the group, highly encourage you to do that. Also, though, as we're wrapping up, and we can address some of these questions as they come in, I wanted to make sure that we gave each of our panelists the opportunity to, really share maybe what is one key takeaway or highlight. I know there's been so many great takeaways and highlights throughout the presentation and the dialogue. But based on today's discussion, if there's one thing you wanted today's attendees to get out of this session, what would it be? And maybe Nicole, maybe we start with you.
Sure. I guess I would say, and it's my experience, I should have said I have a board of 12. So it is a more compact group. I would say like not letting perfect be the enemy of good. So, it does seem like a very daunting activity. And I think just having the conversations and getting the board thinking that way, talking about the strategic issues, the strategic challenges, and including the staff and the committees in that, the process itself is somewhat therapeutic. And I think it takes on its own life as well. So I wouldn't hold back from getting into it. I guess my other takeaway would just be like, keep it short, keep it simple, so it's usable. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Larry, how about yourself?
I'm going to build on what Nicole said, and I'm going to say communicate internally with your staff to make sure, again, everybody understands where and how they dial into the plan, where they support the strategies. And then externally communicate, again, to your board, keep them up to date on progress, communicate to your technical committees, your advisory groups, your special interest groups, your local chapters. All the different stakeholders have a different role to play. So you're communicating internally and also externally. And finally, if you're doing survey work up front, where you're looking at drivers, political drivers, regulatory drivers, technology drivers that affect your profession or your industry, make sure you share the findings of those surveys with different groups within your organization. So a lot of us have like a government relations committee. And so we shared the feedback from the policy question on that survey that kicked off our strategic planning process with the government relations committee. Take that intelligence that you've spent a lot of time and a lot of money investing in and share it with those respective stakeholders that can actually use it and benefit their own operations.
That's great. That's great. And Susanna, last but certainly not least, any words of wisdom to share with the group?
It's great advice all around. Strategic planning, this blue sky thinking part of strategic planning is really engaging, particularly for board members. And I think we've driven home the message that it can be and should be for staff as well. It's a lot of fun. But I want to encourage everybody to not shy away from the hard work that's really needed to operationalize your plan. So we started in the beginning by talking a little bit about, I don't want my plan to be something that sits on the shelf. We've talked about some examples, in fact, shared some examples of how you can really create like a one-page snapshot to really crystallize and visualize your priorities. Well, I think, and I've seen that there are big rewards in making those visions come to life when you really do the hard work to integrate those ideals into your work. And so we've touched on it a few different times, but I just want to encourage everybody to lean into that because it's hard work, but it pays off and it's really worth it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I cannot thank you all enough for participating in today's session. I think this was great discussion. I know as our organization is embarking on our strategic planning process, that there was a lot of great takeaways that I was making notes, and I know some of my colleagues are taking notes, and just really appreciate you taking the time today to join us to talk about your strategic planning journey and your willingness to help share that feedback and insights with the STEM community within CES. So thank you again. And I just wanted to thank you all for attending and just share with you that next on today's agenda is actually a 15-minute break, which is going to be followed by 3 amazing concurrent sessions that'll start at 1:45 Eastern. So be sure to check out the schedule and see which one of those you want to attend. If there's more than one that you want to attend, remember that these are going to be recorded so you can go back and view them as on-demand access. And also make sure to grab your complimentary Starbucks coffee during the break, which was compliments of Visit Seattle. And we appreciate Visit Seattle's support of CES and the Access 21 event. So thank you again, and we will see everybody at 1:45. Have a great day, everyone.